can you give a little bit of background context, just so for those who aren't aware, people can get a sense of your sort of life experience background? What have you been spending the past decades doing?
Sure. I'm a professor of neurosurgery at the Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, New York. It's on Long Island. I went to medical school at Columbia University in Manhattan. I did my neurosurgical training at the University of Miami. And I've been at Stony Brook since 1991. I'm a professor of neurosurgery, as I mentioned. I do a lot of research on brain blood flow and spinal fluid flow inside the brain. And I have a very strong interest in philosophy of mind, in philosophy of science. And I'm a Christian, I'm Catholic, and I believe that faith and reason are one thing. There's only one truth, and I think the best science and the best way to understand the mind and the brain is from a Christian perspective. I began to look a little more critically at materialism in neuroscience, the materialist understanding of the mind. The understanding that I had was that the brain explains the mind completely. And there's a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist named Wilder Penfield who worked back in the middle of the 20th century. And Penfield had actually said that that was the fundamental question that he asked in his career was, does the brain explain the mind completely? And he started out like I did as a materialist, believing that it did. And over his career, he came to see very clear evidence that the brain does not explain the mind completely. The brain plays an important role in the mind, but there's aspects of the mind that are not in the brain. And I found that the way of understanding the human soul that began with Aristotle and St. Augustine, and I think culminated in St. Thomas Aquinas, really was the best way to understand the mind and the brain, that we do have souls. And it actually fits the neuroscience very well.
A viewer of this channel, there's a certain percentage that will want to kind of reduce everything down to a material explanation. Like everything ends up being physics and chemistry. Everything ends up being atomic in nature. And if you wouldn't mind, from, just to distill some of the main lines of evidence from your book, what would be certain things that you've come across during your career and during your research that you see as pointing away from that total materialistic explanation of what a human being is? Like, what are some of these kind of major theses that you're putting forward in the book?
Sure. Well, there are several lines of evidence, I think. In fact, you might say there are three. One is just logic, and there are all sorts of logical reasons that classical philosophers, who I think were quite right, have put forth as reasons why the soul cannot strictly be a physical thing, like from the body. There are also just my anecdotal experience. And there's hard neuroscience. There's a ton of neuroscience evidence that supports the view that the soul is real, and that the mind is not explained entirely by the brain. I think that probably the best way to start is just with my kind of anecdotal experience, and it is anecdotal, but there's a lot of it. What I noticed early in my career was that I had a lot of patients who had brains that were quite deficient. You do a CAT scan or an MRI, and they're missing parts of their brains, or all kinds of issues. And of course, some people were quite disabled with that, but not everybody. There were patients who were missing a lot of their brain who really were perfectly all right. One particularly striking patient was a young lady. We have a picture of her MRI in the book. And about 2/3 of her brain was missing and just replaced by fluid. And we knew this when she was born because we had seen it on the prenatal ultrasounds. And I counseled her family that, the future didn't look too bright for her. Even at that point, I realized that there's some ambiguity here. So I didn't say she was definitely going to be profoundly disabled, but I suspected she would be. And as she's grown up, she's a perfectly normal person. She's in her mid-20s now. She's a delightful, intelligent young lady. If you were to meet her, she's a perfectly normal person. She's missing probably 2/3 of her brain. I have a number of other patients who have the same thing. I have a young lady who's now in she's about 30. who's missing a good deal of the back part of her brain and has fluid in there, who is a gifted student in school. She's a published musician. She has a master's degree in English literature. She's brilliant. I have another young man who is missing about half his brain, who just graduated from high school, and he's a normal kid. Perfectly normal kid. He loves sports. He's just like you and me. Virtually all the materialist theories say that consciousness comes from interactions between neurons within the brain cortex on the surface of the brain. And these people don't have a brain cortex. I have patients who have a condition called hydrocephalus, which is a condition where when they were in their mother's womb, they had strokes that destroyed both of their brain hemispheres. So the only part of the brain that they have is a little tiny is part of their brain stem. And they're quite handicapped, but they're fully conscious people. They smile, they laugh, they're awake, they sleep. And virtually all of the materialist theories of how the mind relates to the brain propose that the mind is the interaction of neurons in the cerebral cortex on the surface of the brain. But there are people who are conscious who don't have a cerebral cortex and who don't even have brain hemispheres, and they're still conscious. So the materialist theories just don't add up. They just don't make sense. The kind of a seminal moment for me and my understanding of this was many years ago. I was doing an operation on a woman who had a brain tumor in her left frontal lobe, and we had to do a awake surgery, meaning that she had to be awake while I was operating on her, because I had to map the surface of her brain and find out where her speech area was so I didn't inadvertently damage it as I was taking out the tumor. And you can do that with local anesthesia so people don't feel pain. So I had a conversation with her as I was taking out the tumor, which is involving a lot of her left frontal lobe. So I was taking out a major part of her brain as I was talking to her. And she was perfectly normal. We talked about the weather. We talked about her family, about the cafeteria food, all that stuff. And she was fine. The operation took 3 or 4 hours. And at the end of the surgery, she was perfectly normal. And I thought as I left the operating room is that none of my neurosurgery textbooks that often took a materialist perspective on things predicted this or explained this. I mean, how can you be talking to somebody when you're taking out a major part of the brain that supposedly is involved in their ability to think? So I got looking at the scientific evidence. I went to the scientific literature and began reading about the mind-brain relationship, and found a lot of interesting stuff.
Now, if someone were to look at that and, because another example that's coming to my mind is the classic Phineas Gage example where he gets the railroad spike that goes through. But if I recall that story correctly, it's basically like the part of his brain that wasn't initially responsible for certain things ends up learning how to do the things that the part of the brain that was damaged had done prior. I guess it's suggesting mobility or the ability of like brain tissue to take on different roles or something. I mean, I probably sound so stupid as I'm saying this to you.
No,
That's
fine.
something?
I mean, right. The argument that other parts of the brain take over responsibilities when part of the brain is damaged. First of all, it's a very common argument. I mean, that's generally how neuroscientists try to explain things like this. The problem is that, number one, there's very little actual evidence for it. I mean, okay, so what's the evidence? We just presume that. So it's kind of hand waving. The other thing is that in the case of Phineas Gage, his story isn't really all that accurate that you read in books and in the popular press. As I think you're aware, this was the mid 19th century. He was a worker, I believe, working on a railway, and there was an explosion that drove a metal bar through his left eye and went up and came out his frontal lobe. And so he had brain damage, but of course, millions of people have had brain damage. And he recovered from it remarkably. before the accident, I'd been a very devout man. He went to church, all that stuff. After the accident, he was a little more libertine. His personality didn't change all that dramatically. I mean, he was just maybe a little bit looser in his morals. Um, so the change wasn't as dramatic as it's often portrayed. Um, there is no question in neuroscience that emotions and our kind of emotional tone comes largely from our brain. I mean, that's very clear. And we know that from, if you have a few drinks, you're emotionally, you're a little different than if you didn't have drinks. So there's no question that causing changes in the brain, either from alcohol or from an iron spike going through your frontal lobe, can change your personality somewhat. That doesn't mean that everything in your mind comes from your brain. Everything in your mind coming from your brain is a separate statement, and is a statement for which there is no evidence to support it in neuroscience. So we always knew that if a person gets some brain damage, their personality can change. That doesn't mean that everything in your mind is